So I'm here with Patrick Head from Chief Financial Officer of Denver International Airport. Patrick, welcome.
Thank you.
To sunny Nice. Can you tell us about the performance of Denver over the last few years, particularly post the sort of financial crisis?
We've been very fortunate in Denver. We have seen traffic growth fairly steady over the past 3 or 4 years, even through the financial crisis, as we saw rapid growth by Southwest Airlines, a major low-cost carrier, obviously, in the U.S., offsetting some of the reductions you might see from the other traditional carriers, such as United. So we've been very fortunate to have an average of about 3% growth over the past few years, hitting a record year in 2012 with 53 million passengers, a little over 53 million. So we've been very fortunate, and that's obviously been reflected in our financials, what we've seen as a result of the increased passengers coming through and what's happened in the market.
And is that more domestic-focused growth or international? And what's the sort of proportions between the two?
It's primarily domestic. We are over 95% domestic.
Yeah.
We are a domestic hub, very strong domestic hub, geographically well located to connect east and west in the U.S. So we see a lot of traffic, a lot of connecting traffic through. About 45% of our traffic's connecting. But what I would say is over the past year or so, we've seen very good growth in our international sector. While the domestic traffic has been somewhat trailing off and even down in some cases, we're seeing international growth in double digits. We've had United add a new flight to Tokyo on the new 787. Icelandair has added a new flight to Reykjavik over the past year and a half that then connects into Europe. Good, strong traffic into Mexico and Canada. Volaris has started service into Mexico City. So we're seeing the international traffic start to pick up and actually start to be the fastest growing segment of our traffic. We are still predominantly, though, a domestic airport.
Yeah. And in terms of the relationship with airlines, which is obviously a key part of how any airport operates, you've seen strong growth from Southwest. It's a big United hub, I believe. How do you manage, from your perspective, the optimization between having Southwest and United and other carriers?
Well, the way the U.S. airport model works is we cannot discriminate from a price perspective for what the airlines pay. Now, every airlines pay something different because they have different business models. They lease different amounts of spaces from the airports. So we treat them all similar from that perspective. But one of the things that we have done over time is slowly lower our costs. When the airport opened in 1995, it was a higher cost airport. And what we were able to do is the cost per passenger, we've been steadily bringing it down as passenger growth has happened, as well as we've taken initiatives to grow revenues and also from non-airline sources and also reduce the costs. So what we've been really focused on is keeping our costs competitive. It's not about getting costs as low as you possibly can. That's where we're ultimately going to, but it's also about keeping competitive so that Southwest, when making a decision, where do we put that new plane? Can it go to Denver? Can it go to Baltimore? That they're looking at Denver as a very competitive market. It's the same thing for United. We've had to shift a little bit about how we focus on United because as Southwest and Frontier have grown, the yields in Denver for airlines have come down. We are one of the lower fare airports in the country, which is great for travelers, but for the airlines, it's meant a struggle to make Denver profitable. So we've been having to focus on cost reductions in order to make up for those lower yields that we've been seeing.
Yeah, interesting. And do you think, I believe Frontier is subject to a takeover bid?
They are being sold right now. They have a tentative deal with a company called Indigo Partners out of Phoenix that they're negotiating. So.
And how do you think that will affect the way that the traffic volumes at Denver at all and the strategy you've got?
I think that's one of the biggest risks we face because what's happening with Frontier is they were a hub and spoke kind of low-cost carrier that had very strong brand loyalty in Denver. And what Frontier has been very vocal about is they want to transform themselves into this ultra low-cost carrier, the Spirit or Allegiant model in the U.S., the Ryanair type model in Europe. And we don't know what that means. What we do know is that typically ultra low-cost carriers don't have a hub and spoke network, and that's what Frontier currently operates under. So we don't know as they transition and as they get bought by Indigo, who was a major investor in Spirit until recently, what that means they're going to do with the Denver market. So what we've been doing is planning for a potential of a reduction in flights. Frontier's capacity in Denver is actually down about 17 or 18% in 2013 compared to 2012, but we don't know if that's going to continue in the future, if they're going to cut more, or what they may actually do. So we as an airport have been taking the kind of good run we've had, we're really good financial progress over the past few years and building up cash balances that are going to help us weather that storm and deal with the risk because we can't control what happens to Frontier. We can only control what money we've got in the bank, and so we've been building up a cash balance to deal with that potential risk.
Interesting. And when you move outside of the aeronautical activities, I understand there's a very large plans. You have an enormous amount of land outside of the sort of airport boundary. So you have a sort of airport city concept that you're trying to develop. Perhaps you could talk about that a bit, because it seems...
Sure. One of the things that's important not only to us as an airport from a revenue perspective, but also to the region in developing this asset is the development happening on and around the airport.
Yeah.
The mayor of Denver, who ultimately the airport reports up into, we are owned by the city and county of Denver, has made that a very huge part of his platform is the development of the aerotropolis around the airport. And the core to that is the airport city in the center, and we do have a lot of land that we need to leverage in order to build that airport city. And we're doing it for really two major reasons. The first is we want to make sure that compatible development is happening on and around the airport so that we don't become constrained like you see a lot of airports. The old airport in Denver, Stapleton Airport, was that way with houses right at the ends of runways. Yeah. You certainly see pictures at Heathrow with these planes right over the tops of these houses that, that are problems. So we want to make sure the development's compatible. But I think, secondarily, we also want to leverage it to make money. Yeah. As a big asset, we've got 137 square kilometers of land. It costs money to maintain that, and we need to leverage that land holding in order to make more money. And we think this airport city concept is a way to do that with businesses and with people who want to be located at or near an airport that would help them with their goals.
And in terms of development of this real estate portfolio or the airport city concept, is that something you'll fund through your existing resources? I mean, or presumably you'll try and get some significant private sector involved?
I think we'll have to have significant private sector involvement. When you look at the amount of money we expect to be spent over the next 20 years, it could total $5.5 billion US dollars of investment, and I don't think the airport's in a position to be able to fund all of that. No. We're going to fund pieces of it to help enable the development, maybe some infrastructure here and there, take opportunities to be investors in some of these developments, but largely you're going to need to rely on private capital. So we're going to be looking a lot for developers and investors to come in and do a lot of the work and figure out what the market is actually demanding and put that on airports. So you get a traditional ground lease in U.S. airports, along with the airport ownership and potentially some airport investment in the infrastructure.
Yeah. And is this something then that flows through to the sort of single tilt type concept? Does this income benefit the airlines, even though it's outside the fence, or is it completely separate?
We are a dual till and actually a hybrid of the two. We have parts of this that are actually going to benefit the airlines because we have a revenue sharing with the airlines.
Right.
When we make revenue, we share back 50% of the non-airline revenue is up to a cap of $40 million a year. So as we grow these revenue sources, it's going to benefit the airlines. And over the long term, when you look at U.S. airports, because we're not owned by a private shareholder or have shareholders we need to return dividends to, any dollar we make eventually gets reinvested back into the airport. Yeah. So as we make money off of this, it gives us money to maintain the asset, to build runways, to build terminals that help keep the costs lower for the carriers over the very long term.
You mentioned the role of the private sector. Obviously, your status is very different to a lot of airports in Europe.
Sure.
Do you have a view about privatization post sort of well, there's been one success and perhaps one not so much this year in the States. Is that something that you concern yourself with, or?
We certainly look at it. I think it's intellectually interesting to look at, but I think the biggest thing right now is there's just no compelling reason that airports need to privatize in the U.S. Yeah. The big compelling reason as to why cities might look at privatizing the airport was to shore up city finances and get some money out of it that they can then use, because the only way in our U.S. rules for a city to take money out of their airport is to go this privatization route. But when you look at the airports themselves, there's just nothing that's causing us to need access to private capital. Right. We have plenty of access via the debt market to capital that we can use to invest in the airport at very cheap rates because we're in a tax-exempt municipal market. So there's just nothing on the horizon that would cause me to think that privatization is going to take off a lot in the U.S. Now, what I would say is there may be opportunities on specific airports to privatize parts of that airport, such as the airport city and doing private development there. But the airport as a whole, I'm not seeing privatization take off anytime soon.
And final question, what's the biggest challenge you've got in the next 2 years?
I think our biggest challenge is simply what's going to happen with our passenger traffic. After record years over the past few years, we're seeing it down this year, and traffic's going to actually be down. And what happens with one of our major carriers in Frontier, and what do we do to weather that storm? I think over the long term, we think the traffic's going to come back and will be good, but what happens the next couple of years is going to be important to the airport. And how do we deal with a capital plan and maintenance of an aging facility? It's 20 years old now that we have to invest back into, with the potential of traffic growth potentially being slower or even negative at times.
Excellent. Thank you, Patrick.
Yeah, thank you.
Good to see you.